Now to that other visit. All going according to plan, US President Barack Obama will arrive here later this month to great fanfare and indeed perhaps some protests. But you might be surprised to hear that 166 years ago, an historical figure who greatly inspired Obama's life also visited this country. Back in 1845, former slave Frederick Douglass landed on these shores to do a lecture tour for the American Anti-Slave Society. His talks were a massive success and he ended up staying in the country for several months. So how did a man born a slave become such a significant figure in American history? Dr. Lee Jenkins, Senior Lecturer in Modern English at University College Cork, and Margaret E. Ward, financial journalist and New Yorker, are here to tell me about the life and times of Frederick Douglass and about his trip to Ireland. And Margaret, let's start with the early life. He was born in Maryland as a slave.
He was. His name was Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, and he was born a slave in February 1818, and his mother's name was Harriet, and she was also a slave. He was born on a plantation, and very soon thereafter he was separated from his mother. He didn't know his mother particularly well, and he only met her 5 or 6 times.
Let's hear an extract from the book that he wrote, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, which is why we know so much of the detail of his early life. This is about the practice of separating young children born into slavery from their mothers.
My mother and I were separated when I was but an infant, before I knew her as my mother. It is a common custom in the part of Maryland from which I ran away to part children from their mothers at a very early age. Frequently, before the child has reached their 12th month, its mother is taken from it and hired out on some farm a considerable distance off, and the child is placed under the care of an old woman, too old for field labor. For what this separation is done, I do not know, unless it be to hinder the development of the child's affection towards its mother, and to blunt and destroy the natural affection of the mother for the child. This is the inevitable result.
Now, his mother died when he was very young, but he wasn't around for her death.
No, what happened is slaves were set in that part of the United States anyway, were separated very early from their mother. She was sent to work on a plantation as a field hand, I think when he was under a year old. This was 12 miles away. So in order for her to come and visit her son, she would have to do a full day's work in the fields, and she would have to set off without permission, really. They were supposed to have permission, and walk and walk and walk and walk. And she would get there and she would see him, and then she'd have to start back again, because if you didn't show up in the fields at sunrise, you'd be whipped to within an inch of your life.
And he would have seen a lot of violence used against slaves when he was very young.
Yes, there's a horrific scene in the book about his aunt, I think it was Hester, wasn't it, Lee?
Yes.
Aunt Hester, who seemed to be a favorite kind of whipping toy of the overseer.
How did he learn to read and write?
This is the most extraordinary thing. When he was about 7, as we said, his mother died, and he was then old enough, that he could start working on different plantations. And eventually, he's made his way to a house in Baltimore that was belonging to the relative of his master, and there was a woman there, Sophia Auld, A-U-L-D, who treated him very kindly, and he said she was almost angelic, and she had never been a slave owner. She actually didn't know how to treat slaves, so she started to teach him his ABCs and to show him this, that, and the other thing, until her husband, who knew kind of the social mores of slavery, yelled at her and said that she would ruin the slave by teaching him to read. And but he had the basics. So what he would do is he would try and find books or newspapers. One time she found him with a newspaper and snatched it off him. And he'd also talk to the white boys in the neighborhood and kind of subtly learn from them, well, what are you doing in school? Show me what you're doing in school. And he would also learn from laborers in the area. I think an Irish laborer he bumped into at some stage along the way. But he had the basics and he taught himself.
And as he said, as he explains in his own narrative, it opened up a whole new world for him.
The more I read, the more I was led to abhor and detest my enslavers. I could regard them in no other light than a band of successful robbers who had left their homes and gone to Africa and stolen us from our homes, and in a strange land reduced us to slavery. I loathe them as being the meanest and most wicked of men. As I read and contemplated the subject, behold, that very discontentment which Master Hugh had predicted would follow my learning had already come, to torment and sting my soul to unutterable anguish. As I writhed under it, I would at times feel that learning to read had been a curse rather than a blessing. It had given me a view of my wretched condition without the remedy.
How did he escape? How did he end up in the Union States as an escaped slave?
There were two potential escapes. The first one says was he was hired out again on different plantations to a man called Friedland, and he had been teaching the slaves there to read and write when they were supposed to be at Sunday worship service, and he tried to get a pass and write passes for them to escape, but that first attempt was foiled. Later on, he had been sent out to a slave breaker, a Mr. Covey, who nearly killed him on several occasions by whipping him to within an inch of his life.
Mind you, Douglas returned the compliment.
Douglas did. Douglas stood up to him at the age of 16 and actually beat him. Now, I mean, for a black man, a black slave to beat a white man was, punishable by death. But this man, Covey, never told anybody because he had a reputation as a slave breaker. So he recognized that economically it was probably not best to let this out. So eventually, Douglas met a freed slave, and she helped him get papers. Now, we don't learn in his first book how it happened because this was still during slavery times and he didn't want anybody to know how he had done it. But in subsequent books, we learned that he got the pass of a free slave who was, I think, a merchant seaman. He worked on the rivers and he made his way up to New York and eventually up to New England, to Massachusetts.
Yeah, and Lee, why did he end up in Ireland? Because to some extent he came to Ireland to escape from the USA, didn't he?
Yeah, when Douglas published his narrative, it made him very vulnerable to being recaptured. There was a law in America at the time called the Fugitive Slave Law, which allowed southern slaveholders, if a slave had run away from their plantation, legally to go into the supposedly free states of the North and recover the slave. And slave testimony, in fact, the testimony of African Americans was discounted in the American legal system then. So very many runaway slaves were vulnerable to this. And of course, by disclosing, as he'd done, details of where he'd been born, who his master was, etc., Douglas would have been a very high-profile trophy for the slaveholding South had they recaptured him. So perhaps his primary motive for coming over here was to remove himself while things were hot in the States.
For the heat to die down, as it were, for a couple of years. And he had a fairly uncomfortable journey, or at least there was one moment in the journey on the way to Ireland which was potentially very uncomfortable for him.
Well, he had a very uncomfortable journey altogether because he was forced to travel in steerage, even though he paid for a first-class ticket on the Cunard line. The ship was called the Cambria. And then matters became worse when some southern passengers on the boat attempted to throw Douglas overboard, apparently because they didn't want him to spread the anti-slavery message in Europe. And he was only saved by the intervention, as he tells it, of an Irish passenger, a man from Dublin, who intervened and threatened to throw the southern gentleman overboard if he didn't leave Mr. Douglas alone.
And then he arrived in Dublin and adapted fairly quickly. He seemed to have got on extremely well in Dublin.
Yes, Douglas spoke with O'Connell at Conciliation Hall in Dublin, which was when Daniel O'Connell gave him that great honour of calling him the Black O'Connell of the United States. But Douglas travelled round Ireland. He didn't remain in Dublin for any extended period.
And he came here in 1845. Would he have had much contact with the famine? I mean, we were talking about Queen Victoria being sheltered from the famine. I presume it was less likely that Frederick Douglass would have been sheltered from the effects of the famine.
I think when Douglas was here, it's the autumn of 1845 when he was in the west of Ireland. It seems that only the very early indications of was happening were apparent. I mean, if you look at the newspaper reports of Douglas's visit, you sometimes see notices of problems with, the potato crop, but it was by no means clear that such a terrible disaster was coming. However, Douglas has been accused by at least one of his biographers of ignoring Irish distress.
Well, he does describe the poverty. He does describe the plight of the people, and particularly in Dublin, for example.
Yes, and he did that subsequently. Douglas wrote 3 accounts of his life, and in one that he published in 1855, My Bondage and My Freedom, there he does talk about the poverty and the suffering that he saw both in Dublin and in the rural west of Ireland, and compares that explicitly with the lot of the slave as he'd remembered it.
Possibly the most important period that he spent in Ireland, though, was in Cork. Explain to me why Cork was very, very important in the context of the anti-slavery movement at that time in Ireland.
Well, Cork had long been a hub for anti-slavery within Ireland, partly because, as a port city, it had been important in provisioning the British Empire. It was a major butter port, for instance, providing butter throughout the empire, but more specifically, Cork also provisioned the British in the slaveholding West Indies. And it was in that context that the first Cork Anti-Slavery Society was founded to bring about the end of the international slave trade. And then when that finished in the 1830s, attention was turned instead to domestic slavery within the US.
And he was making these speeches. He was quite a performer.
He was a performer. You have to remember that in the pre-media age, some of these public speeches could last 2 or 3 hours, and so Douglas had to make them entertainments for people as well as committed political events. So he would make the audience laugh. He was a great mimic of the white southern slave owners, for instance. He used his own body, often quite daringly and theatrically. He'd remove his shirt and turn around and show his bare back with the whip marks on it. And if you read the newspaper reports of his speeches, the gasps of the crowd are noted by the reporters. He had the manacles and the chains that slaves were forced to wear. So in this way, and his first-hand witness and testimony to the slave system really drew the audience in and did a lot to advance the cause in Cork and in Ireland. And
how much of an influence, Margaret, do you think he was on Barack Obama, on the speechifying style of Barack Obama, the rhetoric of Obama?
I think he was a huge influence, but if you look at what he was influenced by, once he learned how to read, I said earlier that he sought out books, and one of the books he found was called The Columbian Orator, and it looked at the language of the founding fathers of the United States. And in that way, Douglas taught himself the oratory style, and the language that went into the Constitution and that was used over and over again. And we see that in Barack Obama's speeches, in JFK's speeches, and many people's speeches who studied the language of the founding fathers and who have an interest in great oration. So I think that's the first influence. And the second influence, of course, is that this is a man who, way before his time, stood for universal human rights. So even afterwards, when he became a freed slave, thanks to money that was given by people in Britain and Ireland.
He bought his freedom.
He bought his freedom. He did buy his freedom. He then went back and was a fantastic speaker and a newspaper, author and all of that. But he also fought for women's rights. So he believed everybody should be treated the same, regardless of their religion or gender.
Now, you mentioned, Lee, that he met O'Connell, and O'Connell described him as the Black O'Connell. O'Connell, of course, being a great anti-slavery advocate himself. He also met another very distinguished Irishman, or Corkman, because he took the temperance pledge from Father Matthew.
He did. He took the pledge from Father Matthew in Cork City and delivered a speech on slavery and intemperance in Cork. Unfortunately, though, Douglas would later fall out with Matthew. He visited the States in 1849, and at that point the anti-slavery movement in the US wanted to prevent visitors like Matthew from going into the southern slaveholding states. It was seen to sanction slavery if they went down there. But Matthew insisted that he would visit the South because he felt that otherwise the Irish there would remain slaves to drink, and this was his priority.
And does he write favourably of his visit to Ireland, of the time that he spent in Ireland? Does he write affectionately of that period?
He writes very affectionately about it and gives it really tremendous significance in the evolution of his journey from slave to freed man. He came into his own in many respects here.
And just briefly, Margaret, go through what happens Douglas, when he goes back, you've already given us some indication, it goes back to the USA.
So he goes back and he is a free man. So therefore he is no longer worrying about being arrested. He was married before he left for Ireland to a woman called Anna Murray, and they had 5 children. He continued to work with the abolitionists in the northern states of the United States, but then he founded his own newspaper called the North Star, and he started to have falling out with some of the abolitionists as his own ideas became independent of theirs. In previous times, they had almost been father-like, and he continued to publish and speak, and also to lobby for the women to have the vote and to be equal citizens.
Well, fascinating story, and President Obama is unlikely to be visiting University College Cork, despite the historic connections between the college and one of his heroes. You hoped...
Only the White House knows where the president will go.
Exactly. This is very, very true. Just harking back to, by the way, Douglas in Cork, with 1 S, I presume, is not called after Frederick Douglass with 2 S's, no?
No, and Barrack Street in Cork is not called after Barack Obama.
Yeah, okay. That will come up as well. Eda Maloney rang to say, my great-grandfather won a cup for horse racing in 1911. It was presented by King George V in Leopardstown. It weighed a stone and was solid silver and is on loan to Leopardstown this year because of the 100th anniversary, the centenary of when it was won. That's all we've got time for. Lee Jenkins and Margaret E. Ward, thank you both very much indeed. By the way, a republication of the Frederick Douglass narrative, that book I was talking about, will be launched in the Glasnevin Cemetery Museum next Thursday by Nettie Douglas, his great-great-granddaughter. Royalties to conserve